She was a billionaire. He was a broke single dad with dinosaur stickers on his laptop. And in a room full of executives, she asked him the one question that nobody, not even she, saw coming. Is she prettier than me? 5 words. That's all it took to unravel a wall she'd spent years building. But what happened next? That's the part no one was ready for. If you want to see how this story ends, stay with me until the very last word. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story travels, and let's get into it. Mason Reed had a routine, and he protected it the way some men protect their reputations or their bank accounts. Every morning at 6:15, he poured 2 bowls of cereal, one for himself, one for Oliver, and set them on the small kitchen table in their 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago. Oliver always wanted the blue bowl. Not the green one, not the white one, the blue one. And if the blue bowl was dirty, Mason washed it before Oliver came shuffling out of his room with his eyes barely open and his Spider-Man pajamas twisted sideways. That was the deal. That was the whole architecture of Mason's life at 32 years old. Keep the boy fed, keep the boy safe, keep the boy from noticing how empty everything else had become. He worked as a senior software engineer at Sterling Axis Technologies, a fast-growing tech company headquartered in a glass tower on Michigan Avenue, the kind of building that looked like money from the outside and smelled like stress on the inside. Mason had been there for 5 years, longer than most engineers lasted before burning out or getting poached by a bigger firm. He stayed because the work was steady, the health insurance covered Oliver's asthma medication, and because staying meant he didn't have to think about what came next. Thinking about what came next was dangerous. Thinking about what came next meant thinking about what came before, and what came before was Rachel. Rachel, who had died 4 years ago at 27 from a brain aneurysm that no one saw coming. One morning she was laughing in the kitchen making scrambled eggs while Oliver, barely 3 at the time, tried to feed Cheerios to the cat. By that afternoon she was gone. No warning, no symptoms, no chance to say anything that mattered. Mason remembered the hospital hallway. He remembered a doctor with tired eyes explaining something about a ruptured vessel, about how fast it had happened, about how she wouldn't have felt pain. He remembered not believing that last part. He remembered standing outside in the parking lot afterward, holding his phone, staring at Rachel's last text, "Pick up milk on the way home," and thinking that he would never buy milk again without wanting to throw up. He didn't throw up. He went home. He picked up Oliver from Rachel's mother's house. He made dinner. He gave Oliver a bath. He read him a story about a bear who couldn't find his hat, and when the boy finally fell asleep, Mason sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the refrigerator and cried so hard he thought something inside his chest might actually break. That was 4 years ago. He hadn't cried like that since. He hadn't done a lot of things since. By the time Oliver turned 7, Mason had built a life that worked the way a well-coded program works, efficiently, predictably, and without unnecessary variables. He woke up. He made breakfast. He dropped Oliver at school. He went to work. He picked Oliver up. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He read a bedtime story. He sat alone in the living room watching whatever was on television without really watching it, and then he went to bed. Weekends were for Oliver. Parks, museums, the occasional movie. Oliver was obsessed with dinosaurs, had been since he was 4, and Mason had taken him to the Field Museum so many times that the security guards knew them by name. Oliver had a plastic T-Rex named Gerald that went everywhere with him, including, on one memorable occasion, into the bathtub where Gerald had nearly gone down the drain and Oliver had screamed like the world was ending. Mason loved his son with a ferocity that sometimes scared him. The kind of love that made him check Oliver's breathing 3 times a night during flu season. The kind that made him rehearse conversations with teachers before parent conferences because he wanted to ask the right questions. The kind that made him turn down a promotion 2 years ago because it would have meant later hours and less time at home. He was a good father. Everyone said so. His mother, his sister, the other parents at Oliver's school. And Mason held on to that the way a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood, because being a good father was the only identity he had left that didn't feel like a lie. Everything else, the loneliness, the quiet apartment after Oliver went to bed, the way he sometimes caught himself reaching for the other side of the mattress at 3 in the morning, he kept locked in a room inside his chest that he never opened. Not for anyone. which is why what happened on that Tuesday in October made absolutely no sense. It started with Dave Barker. Dave was Mason's cubicle neighbor, a 35-year-old project manager with a receding hairline and an aggressive optimism about other people's love lives that bordered on clinical. Dave had been trying to set Mason up with someone, anyone, for the better part of 2 years. "Her name is Lauren," Dave said, leaning over the partition between their desks like a man delivering classified intelligence. "She's a friend of my wife's sister. 29, works in marketing, no kids, likes hiking." "No." "You didn't even think about it." "I thought about it. The answer's no." "Mason." Dave lowered his voice, which was his way of pretending to be sensitive. "It's been 4 years, man. Rachel wouldn't have wanted you to—" "Don't." Mason's voice came out sharper than he intended, and he saw the flash of hurt cross Dave's face. He softened. "I appreciate it. I do. But I'm just not ready." Dave studied him for a moment, then sighed the way people sigh when they think they know better than you but have run out of ways to say it. "She's really nice, though. Just coffee. 1 hour. If it's terrible, I'll never bring it up again." "You said that about the last one." "This time I mean it." Mason turned back to his screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He stared at the lines of code without seeing them. The truth was, he'd been saying no for so long that the word had lost all its weight. It was just a reflex now, like flinching when someone throws something at your head. He didn't even think about why he was saying it anymore. He just said it. But something about that particular Tuesday. Maybe it was the weather, gray and cold in the way October in Chicago always manages to feel like a personal insult. Something made him pause. "Fine," he said quietly. Dave's head reappeared over the partition so fast it was almost comical. "Wait, what?" "Fine. Coffee. 1 hour. And if it's terrible, you never bring it up again." "I said that last. This time you'll mean it." Dave grinned like he'd won the lottery and immediately pulled out his phone, presumably to text his wife's sister before Mason could change his mind. Mason turned back to his code and tried to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. He didn't mention it to anyone else. Not intentionally, anyway. But later that afternoon, around 4:30, he was packing up his bag, laptop, charger, the small Tupperware container that had held Oliver's leftover mac and cheese, which Mason had eaten for lunch because cooking for one adult felt like a waste of effort, when Vanessa Sinclair appeared at his desk. Vanessa Sinclair was the CEO of Sterling Access Technologies. She was 30 years old, which made her one of the youngest CEOs in Chicago's tech scene, and she carried herself with the kind of controlled intensity that made people either deeply respectful or deeply uncomfortable, usually both. She was tall, 5'8" or 5'9", with dark hair that she wore pulled back in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't. She dressed like money, but not the flashy kind, the quiet kind. The kind that didn't need logos or labels because the fabric and the cut spoke for themselves. She had sharp eyes, the color of strong coffee, and a face that could shift from warm to severe in the space of a breath. In the 3 years since she'd taken over the company from her father, Vanessa had tripled Sterling Access's valuation, poached 2 of Microsoft's best AI researchers, and developed a reputation in the industry as someone who was brilliant, driven, and nearly impossible to impress. Business magazines called her things like the Ice Queen of Michigan Avenue and Silicon Valley's Midwest Nightmare. She never publicly responded to any of it, which somehow made the mystique worse. Mason had interacted with her maybe a dozen times in 5 years, always briefly, always professionally. She knew his name, which surprised him. She'd once complimented a system architecture he'd designed for a client integration, which surprised him more. Beyond that, their relationship was exactly what you'd expect between a billionaire CEO and a mid-level engineer, distant, hierarchical, and defined by the organizational chart that separated them by roughly 6 levels of management. So when she appeared at his desk that Tuesday afternoon, Mason's first thought was that something was wrong. His second thought was that his code had broken something. His third thought, which arrived only after he noticed she wasn't carrying a tablet or a report or anything that suggested an emergency, was confusion. "Heading out early?" she asked. Her voice was neutral, the way it always was. Controlled, precise, like every word had been vetted by an internal committee before being released. "Oliver has a thing at school tomorrow," Mason said, which was true. but not the real reason he was leaving. I need to prep his costume. What's the costume? The question caught him off guard. CEOs didn't ask about their employees' kids' school costumes. That wasn't a thing that happened. Triceratops, he said after a beat. He's going through a phase. Triceratops is a solid choice. Better than T-Rex. Everyone goes T-Rex. Mason blinked. That's exactly what Oliver said. A small smile crossed Vanessa's face, so brief that if Mason had blinked at the wrong moment, he would have missed it entirely. Smart kid. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with something Mason couldn't identify. Vanessa glanced at his desk, and her eyes landed on the laptop. The lid was covered in stickers, dinosaurs mostly, with a few rockets and one lopsided smiley face that Oliver had drawn with a Sharpie directly onto the surface. Mason had been meaning to clean it up for months, but never did, because every time he looked at it, he thought of Oliver's face when he'd stuck them on, so serious and deliberate, like he was decorating a spaceship. New stickers, Vanessa said. Mason looked at the laptop, then back at her. He adds one every Friday. It's our thing. Another pause. Vanessa shifted her weight slightly, which was unusual for her. She was normally still in the way that expensive sculptures are still, perfectly balanced, deliberately composed. But right now she seemed almost uncertain, and the unfamiliarity of that expression on her face made Mason pay closer attention. Big plans tonight? She asked. Her tone was casual, but there was something underneath it, something tight, like a guitar string tuned just a little too high. Mason hesitated. He wasn't sure why. It was a simple question. He had a simple answer. But something about the way Vanessa was standing there, slightly too close, slightly too still, made the simple answer feel complicated. Actually, he said, and immediately regretted starting the sentence because now he had to finish it. I have a date. The change in Vanessa's face was almost imperceptible. Almost. Her expression didn't shift. It hardened, just barely, like a crack forming in glass that you can only see when the light hits it at the right angle. A date, she repeated. Yeah, coffee, it's nothing. Dave set it up. Dave Barker? Yeah. Dave Barker, who once tried to make conversation with me at the holiday party by explaining how fantasy football works for 15 minutes. Mason felt the corner of his mouth twitch despite himself. That's the one. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she looked directly at him. Not at his desk, not at the laptop, not at the window behind him, but at him with an intensity that felt physical, and said, Is she prettier than me? The words landed in the space between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Mason's brain did several things simultaneously. It registered the question, rejected it as impossible, replayed it to confirm he'd heard correctly, and then froze entirely like a computer trying to process a command it was never designed to handle. What? Vanessa's expression didn't change. She stood there, perfectly composed, as if she'd asked about quarterly earnings or server uptime, as if the question were routine, as if she hadn't just detonated the professional distance between them with 5 words that no CEO in the history of corporate America had ever said to an employee at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. You heard me, she said, and then, before Mason could formulate anything resembling a coherent response, she turned and walked away. Not quickly, not slowly, just walked away. Heels clicking against the floor with the same precise rhythm as always. Back straight, shoulders level, as if nothing had happened. Mason stood at his desk for a full 30 seconds after she disappeared around the corner, his bag half-zipped, his mouth slightly open, his brain still buffering. Dave's head appeared over the partition. Was that Vanessa Sinclair? What did she want? Mason closed his mouth, zipped his bag, picked it up. Nothing, he said. She wanted nothing. He left the building and walked 2 blocks toward the cafe where he was meeting Lauren before he realized his hands were shaking. Not a lot. Just a tremor, like the aftershock of something seismic happening deep underground. Is she prettier than me? What the hell was that? He stopped on the sidewalk, letting the flow of commuters split around him like water around a stone. The October wind cut through his jacket. His phone buzzed. A text from the babysitter confirming she was at the apartment and Oliver was doing homework. He typed a thumbs up and kept walking. The cafe was on Dearborn, a place called Metric with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs and the kind of carefully cultivated industrial aesthetic that Mason found exhausting, but Dave's wife's sister apparently loved. Lauren was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table, nursing an oat milk latte, looking exactly like the photo Dave had shown him, which was both reassuring and oddly disappointing. She was pretty. Dark blonde hair, green eyes, a smile that came easily. She stood up when she saw him and extended her hand, and Mason shook it and tried to remember the last time he'd shaken a woman's hand on a first date. He couldn't remember because there hadn't been one, not since Rachel. "Mason, I'm Lauren. Dave's told me, well, he's told me a lot. He tends to do that." She laughed, and it was a nice laugh, genuine, unforced. Mason sat down across from her and ordered a coffee, black, because he didn't know what else to order and didn't want to spend time thinking about it. They talked. It was fine. Lauren was smart. She worked in digital marketing for a healthcare startup, which meant she spent her days crafting messaging about medical devices and her nights trying to forget about it. She had a dry sense of humor and a tendency to talk with her hands. She asked good questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. Mason found himself relaxing, just slightly, the way you relax on an airplane when the turbulence stops and you start to believe maybe you're not going to die after all. He told her about his work, skipping the technical details because nobody outside the industry actually wanted to hear about API integration. He told her about his apartment, about the neighborhood, about the Ethiopian restaurant on the corner that had the best injera in the city, and then she asked about Oliver. "Dave mentioned you have a son," she said, stirring her latte. "How old?" 7. "That's a fun age." "It is. He's great." Mason could feel himself smiling, the way he always smiled when he talked about Oliver, and he knew what was happening because he'd watched it happen before, in the few awkward setups he'd agreed to over the years. He was about to become Oliver's dad instead of Mason, and the woman across from him was about to decide whether that was a deal breaker. "He's really into dinosaurs right now," Mason continued, like obsessively. "He has this plastic T-Rex named Gerald that he takes everywhere. Last week he asked me if dinosaurs had feelings, and I spent 45 minutes trying to explain paleontology to a second grader." Lauren smiled, but it was a different smile than before. Thinner, more polite. "That's sweet." "He's got a school thing tomorrow, costume day. He's going as a Triceratops. I've been working on the costume for 2 weeks, and it still looks like a green potato with a paper plate glued to its head." Another thin smile. "You sound like a really devoted dad." There it was. The word, devoted. It was always devoted or dedicated or wonderful, and it always came out sounding like a consolation prize. "You're a great dad, which is why this isn't going to work." Mason had learned to recognize the shift, the moment when the conversation stopped being about two people getting to know each other and started being about one person calculating how much baggage she was willing to carry. It happened in the eyes first, a slight dimming, like someone turning down a lamp. Then, in the body language, a subtle pulling back, a crossing of arms, a reaching for the phone. Lauren didn't reach for her phone, but she did lean back in her chair, and when she spoke again, her voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words like a surgeon choosing instruments. "Can I be honest with you? Please. I think you're really great. Seriously. You're smart, you're funny, you're clearly an amazing father, but I have to be honest, I'm not sure I'm at a place in my life where I'm ready for all of that." All of that meaning Oliver. I don't mean it like, it's not about him specifically, it's just, I'm 29. I'm still figuring out my own stuff, and the idea of stepping into a situation where there's already a kid and the mom isn't, Dave told me about your wife, and I'm so sorry, I really am, but you don't have to explain. I just don't want you to think, Lauren. He said it gently, not angry, not bitter, just tired. It's okay, I get it. She looked at him with something that might have been relief or might have been guilt or might have been both. You're not upset. No, I appreciate you being honest. Most people aren't. They finished their drinks. She hugged him on the sidewalk outside the cafe, which struck Mason as oddly intimate for someone who just explained why she didn't want to be part of his life. He watched her walk away, her coat pulled tight against the wind, and tried to figure out what he was feeling. Not heartbroken. You had to care enough for something to break, and he hadn't gotten that far. Not angry either. Lauren wasn't wrong. Dating a widowed single father at 29 was a lot. He knew that. He'd always known that. What he felt was something quieter and worse, a kind of confirmation. The sense that the life he'd built, the careful, coded, controlled life, was exactly as small as he'd always suspected, that the walls he'd constructed to protect himself and Oliver had done their job too well. They'd kept everything out, including the possibility of anything getting in. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, hands in his pockets, watching the traffic crawl down Dearborn. A bus stopped in front of him, and for a moment, through the rain-streaked window, he saw a woman sitting alone in the back row, staring at her phone with an expression of profound boredom. He thought, without meaning to, about Rachel, about how she used to fall asleep on buses, her head against the window, her mouth slightly open, snoring in a way she always denied. He missed her. Not the sharp, gasping missing of the first year, but the dull, permanent ache that had settled into his bones like arthritis. A missing you learn to live with because the alternative is not living at all. His phone was in his hand before he made a conscious decision to pick it up. He opened his messages, scrolled past the babysitter, past Dave, past his mother. His thumb hovered over a name he'd never texted for any reason outside of work. Vanessa Sinclair. He stared at it. The rational part of his brain, the engineer, the problem solver, the man who'd survived the last 4 years by never doing anything impulsive, told him to put the phone away, to go home, to check on Oliver, to eat leftover pasta and watch something mindless and go to bed and wake up tomorrow and do it all again. Instead, he typed, "Date didn't go well." He hit send before he could think about it. Then he stared at the screen, horrified, as the message turned from blue to delivered. "What are you doing?" his brain demanded. "She's your CEO. She's a billionaire. She asked you an insane question 4 hours ago, and you're texting her about your failed date like she's your buddy from college?" He was composing an apologetic follow-up, something along the lines of, "Sorry, wrong number," or "Ignore that, autocorrect," when the 3 dots appeared. She was typing. His stomach did something it hadn't done in 4 years. It flipped. The response came quickly. "Where are you?" Mason stared at the screen, then typed, "Metric, the cafe on Dearborn." "Stay there." "What?" "Stay there. 20 minutes." Mason put his phone in his pocket, took it out again, read the exchange 3 times to make sure it was real. Then he went back inside the cafe, sat at the same table Lauren had just vacated, and ordered another black coffee from a barista who looked at him with the particular sympathy reserved for people who clearly have nowhere else to go. She arrived in 17 minutes. Mason knew because he'd been counting, which was pathetic, and he knew it was pathetic, and he counted anyway. She came through the door in a way that made 3 separate people look up from their laptops, not because she was loud or dramatic, but because Vanessa Sinclair occupied space differently than normal people. There was a gravity to her, a density, like she was made of something heavier than the rest of them. She wasn't wearing her work clothes anymore. The tailored blazer and heels had been replaced by a dark cashmere sweater, jeans, and ankle boots. Her hair was down. Mason had never seen her hair down, and it changed the geometry of her face in a way he wasn't prepared for. She looked younger, softer, like a different version of herself, one that existed only after business hours. She spotted him, walked over, and sat down across from him without a word of greeting. She flagged down the barista, ordered an espresso, and then looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes. "What happened?" "You drove across Chicago because I sent you a text that I was already in the area." She said it quickly, too quickly, and they both knew it was a lie, but neither of them acknowledged it. "What happened with the date?" Mason studied her for a moment. Sitting across from him in a cafe, out of context, stripped of her title and her corner office and the 17 floors of corporate hierarchy that normally separated them, Vanessa Sinclair looked almost human, which was not a word anyone at Sterling Axis would have used to describe her. "She wasn't ready for Oliver," he said finally. "She was nice about it, but that was the bottom line." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "Did she say that outright?" More or less. She said she wasn't at a place in her life where she could handle stepping into a situation with a kid, especially one where the mom is gone. He paused. She used the word devoted about me, about how I am with Oliver. And that bothered you. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, precise and clean, like she diagnosed the problem without needing to run the full battery of tests. It always bothers me, Mason said, because it sounds like a compliment, but it's actually a disqualifier. Like, congratulations, you're a great dad, which is exactly why no one wants to date you. The espresso arrived. Vanessa wrapped her hands around the cup but didn't drink. You're not wrong. Thanks. That's very comforting. I'm not trying to be comforting. I'm trying to be honest. Mason leaned back in his chair and looked at her. Really looked at her, in a way he never had before because there had never been a context in which looking at Vanessa Sinclair this closely was appropriate. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible, the kind you get from a childhood fall. Her nails were short and unpolished, which surprised him. He'd expected them to be perfect. Can I ask you something? He said. You just texted your CEO about your failed date. I think we're past asking permission. Why did you ask me that earlier at the office? Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A tightening, a wall going up brick by brick in real time. Asked you what? Vanessa. She looked at her espresso, then she looked at the table, then she looked at the window, where the city moved past in a blur of headlights and reflections. When she finally looked back at him, there was something in her eyes he'd never seen there before. Something raw and unfinished. Can I tell you something that stays in this cafe? She said. Yeah. I mean it. Not the office, not Dave Barker, not anyone. I understand. She took a breath, a real one, deep and slow, the kind you take before jumping off something tall. Then she said, I was engaged once, 3 years ago. His name was Daniel. Mason said nothing. He just listened. We met in business school. He wasn't like the other guys there, wasn't trying to prove how smart he was every 5 minutes. He was quiet. Funny, in this really dry way that most people didn't get. He wanted to be a teacher. Can you imagine? A Stanford MBA who wanted to teach high school economics. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hurt to look at. We were supposed to get married in June. What happened? Car accident. January. Some kid ran a red light on Lakeshore Drive doing 60 in a 35. Daniel was on his way to pick up our wedding invitations. She paused. He died holding a box of cream-colored envelopes with our names on them. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mason had ever heard. I didn't know, he said finally. It was inadequate, and he knew it, but it was true. Nobody knows. Not at the company. Not in the press. I made sure of that. She picked up the espresso and took a sip, and her hand was steady, perfectly steady, which told Mason that she'd had a lot of practice keeping her hand steady when the rest of her was falling apart. After Daniel, I did what I do. I worked. I took over the company for my father. I tripled the valuation. I gave interviews about market strategy and disruption and whatever buzzword was trending that quarter. And I didn't think about Daniel, because thinking about Daniel meant thinking about the life I was supposed to have. And thinking about that made me want to burn everything down. I know that feeling, Mason said quietly. I know you do. She looked at him. That's why I noticed you. Noticed me? You leave work at 5:15 every day, on the dot. Doesn't matter if there's a deploy or a crisis or if the entire server farm is on fire. 5:15, you're packing your bag and you're gone. Do you know how unusual that is at my company? I have to pick up Oliver. I know, that's my point. Every Friday, there's a new sticker on your laptop. Every Monday, you have Cheerio dust on your left shoulder that you never notice until lunch. Every time someone asks you to stay late, you say, I can't, Oliver has a thing. And you never explain what the thing is because you don't think you owe anyone an explanation. And you're right, you don't. Mason stared at her. How do you know all that? Vanessa put down the espresso. Because I've been watching you, Mason, not in a creepy way. I don't know what way. In the way you watch someone who's carrying the same weight you're carrying, and they don't even know you can see it. The cafe was almost empty now. The barista was wiping down the counter. Outside, the wind pushed dead leaves along the sidewalk, and somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared and faded. "When you told me about the date," Vanessa said, "I felt something I haven't felt in 3 years. And I'm telling you this because I don't understand it, and I don't know what to do with it. And I thought maybe if I said it out loud to the one person who might actually understand, it would make more sense." "Does it?" "No," she said. "It makes less sense." Mason looked at her across the table. This woman he'd spent 5 years working under. This woman the business world called cold and calculating. This woman who sat in board meetings demolishing competitors and renegotiating contracts worth more than his entire apartment building. And he saw someone who was as tired and lonely and confused as he was. "It doesn't have to make sense tonight," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded slowly, and something in the air between them shifted. Not dramatically, not like a movie, but quietly, the way the temperature drops right before the first snow. You don't see it happen. You just feel it. They sat in the cafe for another hour. They talked about things that had nothing to do with work. About Oliver's dinosaur obsession. About the neighborhood in Evanston where Vanessa grew up. About the way grief changes shape over time but never actually gets smaller. Vanessa told him about Daniel's dog, a golden retriever named Professor, that she'd kept after the accident and who was now 11 years old and mostly blind but still tried to fetch tennis balls in the backyard of her lakeshore townhouse. Mason told her about the time Oliver asked where his mom went, and Mason had said she went somewhere very far away, and Oliver had asked if she took an airplane, and Mason had said yes, and Oliver had asked if she'd bring back souvenirs. Neither of them laughed at that story. But neither of them looked away, either. At 9:30, Mason's phone buzzed. The babysitter. "Oliver's been asking when you're coming home. He says Gerald misses you." Mason read the text and smiled despite himself. "I should go." "Yeah." Vanessa stood up, pulling her sweater tighter around herself. "I should too." They walked out together. The cold hit them immediately, sharp and clean, and they stood on the sidewalk facing each other in the glow of the cafe's window light. "Thank you," Mason said, "for coming. You texted me about your failed date. What was I supposed to do? Leave you on red?" "Most CEOs would." "Most CEOs wouldn't be texted in the first place." They stood there for another moment, and the city moved around them. Cabs, buses, people in heavy coats moving toward warmth, and neither of them moved. "Mason," Vanessa said. "Yeah?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she shook her head and took a step back. "Nothing. Get home to Oliver." "Vanessa!" "Go home!" She turned and walked toward a black car idling at the curb. A driver opened the door for her. She got in. The door closed. The car pulled away. And Mason stood on the sidewalk watching the taillights disappear into the river of traffic on Dearborn Street. His phone buzzed again. The babysitter. "Also, he says he needs you to check for monsters. Apparently there's one in the closet that only you can scare away." Mason started walking toward the train. His hands weren't shaking anymore. But something else was happening inside him. Something he couldn't name. Something he wasn't ready to examine. Something that felt like a door he'd nailed shut 4 years ago creaking open, just an inch, just enough to let a sliver of light through. He got home at 10. The babysitter, a college sophomore named Maya who lived 2 floors up, met him at the door. "He fought bedtime hard tonight," she said, pulling on her coat. "Full negotiations. He wanted 3 stories instead of 2, and he wanted the dinosaur book twice." "He always wants the dinosaur book twice." "I caved on the dinosaur book." "Everyone caves on the dinosaur book." Maya left, and Mason walked through the quiet apartment to Oliver's room. The door was open. The nightlight, a green dinosaur that cast a warm amber glow across the ceiling, was on. Oliver was asleep, sprawled diagonally across the bed in that boneless way only children can manage, with Gerald the T-Rex tucked under one arm and the blankets kicked to the foot of the bed. Mason pulled the blankets up, checked the closet because he'd promised. Stood there looking at his son's face, Rachel's nose, his own jaw, a combination that still sometimes caught him off guard with its perfection, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "I went on a date tonight, buddy," he whispered. It didn't work out. Oliver didn't stir. But something else happened. Something weird. I don't know what it means yet. He leaned down and kissed Oliver's forehead. The boy smelled like soap and peanut butter and something uniquely Oliver, a smell Mason would recognize anywhere, blindfolded, in a crowd of 1,000 children. He went to the living room, sat on the couch, picked up his phone. There was a text from Vanessa, sent 3 minutes ago. "Did you scare the monster?" He typed back, "Check the closet. All clear." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Good. Monsters don't stand a chance against Triceratops dads." Mason stared at the message, read it twice. Then he set the phone on the coffee table, leaned his head back against the couch, and closed his eyes. The apartment was quiet. Oliver was safe. Somewhere across the city, a woman he'd spent 5 years barely knowing was sitting alone in a townhouse on Lakeshore Drive with a blind golden retriever, thinking about cream-colored envelopes and a life she never got to live. And Mason sat in the silence, feeling the weight of everything, the grief, the loneliness, the unexpected warmth of a conversation he never should have had, settle around him like a blanket he didn't know he needed. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. He didn't know what any of this meant. But for the first time in 4 years, the not knowing didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the beginning of something. Mason woke up on the couch at 2 in the morning with a crick in his neck and his phone still sitting on the coffee table where he'd left it. The television was off. The apartment was dark except for the thin line of amber light leaking from under Oliver's door. The dinosaur nightlight, always on, because Oliver had explained with complete seriousness that dinosaurs needed light to guard properly. He sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, and reached for the phone out of habit. Vanessa's last message was still on the screen. "Monsters don't stand a chance against Triceratops dads." He read it again, then locked the phone and went to bed. He didn't text her back. He didn't know what he would say if he did. Wednesday passed the way Wednesdays always passed. Cereal, school drop-off, the train downtown, 8 hours of code and meetings, and Dave Barker talking too loudly on speakerphone 2 feet away. Mason kept his head down. He ate lunch at his desk. He didn't look toward the executive floor. He didn't think about the cafe, or the espresso, or the scar above Vanessa's left eyebrow, or the way her voice had cracked just barely, just once, when she said the word envelopes. He thought about all of those things constantly. At 3:45, his phone buzzed. Not a text, a Slack message, internal, from a handle he'd never received a direct message from before. V. Sinclair. "Quick question. Does Oliver still need help with the Triceratops costume, or did you figure it out?" Mason stared at the message for a solid 10 seconds. Then he typed, deleted, typed again, deleted again, and finally settled on, "The paper plate situation has been resolved. We upgraded to cardboard." Cardboard? Very professional. It's held together with hot glue and optimism. "Send me a picture after the school thing." He almost typed, "Why?" but caught himself. Instead, he typed, "Will do," and put the phone down and stared at his monitor and didn't see a single line of code for the next 20 minutes. Dave leaned over the partition. "You okay? You look weird." "I always look weird." "Weirder than usual. Did something happen with Lauren? She texted my wife and said you were really nice, but she's not ready for the whole package." "Yeah. I got the speech." Dave winced. "I'm sorry, man. I really thought—" "It's fine, Dave." "You want me to—" "No." Dave retreated behind the partition, and Mason went back to pretending to work while his brain ran 2 parallel processes. One debugging a client's authentication module, the other replaying every word Vanessa had said in that cafe, trying to parse the code beneath the conversation the way he'd parse a function looking for a hidden error. She'd said she'd been watching him. Not in a creepy way, she'd clarified, which was exactly what someone would say if they realized how creepy it sounded. But it hadn't sounded creepy. It had sounded lonely. It had sounded like someone standing at a window watching the world move past, noticing the small details because the small details were all she had left. He knew that feeling. He'd lived inside that feeling for 4 years. Oliver's costume day went well. Maya the babysitter sent photos. Oliver in his cardboard Triceratops frill, face paint smeared across his cheeks, grinning so wide that one of his missing front teeth was fully visible. Mason forwarded the photo to his mother, his sister, and then, after hesitating for a full minute, to Vanessa. Her response came in under 30 seconds. "That is the best Triceratops I've ever seen. Tell him I said so." Mason didn't tell Oliver. He wasn't sure how to explain who Vanessa was, in terms a 7-year-old would understand, and he definitely wasn't sure how to explain why his boss was texting him about dinosaur costumes. Thursday and Friday passed. They texted. Not constantly, not in the breathless, every 5 minutes way that people text when they're 22 and infatuated, but steadily. A message here, a reply there. Small things. Vanessa sent him a photo of Professor the Golden Retriever asleep on a pile of throw pillows with the caption, "Board meeting ran long, he's protesting." Mason sent her a video of Oliver explaining, with the gravity of a tenured professor, why ankylosaurs were superior to stegosaurs because their tail is like a wrecking ball, Dad, and stegosaurs just have dumb plates. Vanessa's response, "He's not wrong about the plates." It was easy. That was the part that confused Mason the most. Talking to Vanessa, this woman he'd spent 5 years being slightly intimidated by, this woman whose net worth had more zeros than his checking account had digits, was easy, not smooth, not polished, easy in the way that breathing is easy, the way you don't think about it until someone points out that you're doing it. She was funny, which he hadn't expected, not the sharp, cutting humor of someone who uses wit as a weapon, but a quieter kind, observational, self-deprecating in doses, built on a foundation of paying very close attention to the absurdity of the world around her. She texted the way she talked, directly, with no filler, no emojis except an occasional period that somehow conveyed more emotion than a string of smiley faces ever could. But Mason was careful. He was always careful. Careful was the language he spoke fluently, the operating system he'd been running since Rachel died. And being careful meant recognizing that whatever was happening between him and Vanessa Sinclair was unstable. It was a variable he couldn't predict, a function without a clear output, and Mason Reed did not do well with things he couldn't predict. On Saturday morning, while Oliver was at a birthday party for a kid in his class named Tyler, Mason did something he hadn't done in years. He called his sister. Emily was 3 years older than Mason, lived in Denver with her husband and twin daughters, and had the particular gift of being simultaneously the most supportive and the most brutally honest person he knew. She answered on the second ring. "Someone's either dead or you met someone," she said. "Why are those the only two options?" "Because you never call me on Saturdays unless something major happened. So which is it?" "Nobody's dead." "Oh my God. You met someone?" "I didn't. It's complicated." "They're all complicated. Talk." Mason sat on his kitchen counter, something Rachel used to yell at him for doing, and told Emily everything. The date with Lauren, the question, the cafe, the texts, all of it. Emily listened without interrupting, which was how Mason knew she was taking it seriously, because Emily interrupted everything. When he finished, there was a long pause. "So your billionaire CEO drove across Chicago at 9 o'clock at night because you texted her about your bad date," Emily said. "Yeah." "And she told you about her dead fiancé?" "Yeah." "And now you're texting each other pictures of dogs and dinosaurs. When you say it like that, it sounds like she's in love with you, Mason." The words landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "She's not in love with me. She barely knows me. She knows about the stickers. She knows about the Cheerio dust. She knows you leave at 5:15 every day. That's not barely knowing someone. That's studying someone." "She's my boss, Em. She's a person. She's a billionaire. Also a person." Mason rubbed his face with his free hand. "I'm a 32-year-old software engineer who eats mac and cheese for lunch and can't afford to fix the dishwasher. She has a driver. So? So we don't make sense." "Mason." Emily's voice softened in the way it did when she was about to say something he didn't want to hear but needed to. "Do you like her?" He didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because saying it out loud would make it real, and real things could hurt him. Real things had hurt him before. "I don't know what I feel," he said finally. "I know that talking to her doesn't feel like talking to my CEO. It feels like talking to someone who, I don't know, someone who gets it. Gets what? The thing. The being alone thing. The walking around with this hole in your chest thing that everybody can see but nobody talks about. That's not nothing, Mason. I know. So, what are you going to do? I'm going to pick up Oliver from Tyler's birthday party and spend the rest of the weekend pretending this conversation didn't happen. That's a terrible plan. It's the only one I've got, Emily sighed. Just don't close the door before you know what's on the other side, okay? You've been closing doors for 4 years. Maybe try opening one. That's very poetic. I stole it from a podcast, but the point stands. They hung up. Mason sat on the counter for another minute, staring at the cracked tile above the stove that he'd been meaning to fix since they moved in. Then he went to pick up Oliver. The following week at work was strange. Not obviously strange. Nothing visible had changed. Mason still sat at his desk, still wrote code, still ate lunch from Tupperware, still left at 5:15. Vanessa still ran meetings, still walked the halls with that controlled intensity, still spoke to employees in the same precise, measured tone she always used. But something underneath had shifted, like tectonic plates moving deep below the surface, too far down to see, but strong enough to change the entire landscape above. They didn't talk at the office. Not once. No Slack messages during business hours, no stops by his desk, no hallway encounters that lasted longer than a nod and a good morning. Vanessa was meticulously professional during work hours, and Mason understood why without having to ask. She was the CEO. He was an engineer. Whatever was happening between them existed in a separate space, and she was keeping those spaces apart with the same precision she applied to everything else. But at night, they talked. Every night. Sometimes text, sometimes long phone calls that started at 9 and stretched past midnight while Oliver slept and Professor snored audibly in the background of Vanessa's end. Mason learned things about her that no profile or magazine article had ever captured. That she ate cereal for dinner at least 3 times a week because she hated cooking, that she was afraid of thunderstorms, that she kept Daniel's last voicemail on her phone and listened to it on his birthday every year, that she had a terrible singing voice and sang in her car anyway because it was the one place no one could judge her. And Vanessa learned things about Mason, that he hadn't changed the sheets on Rachel's side of the bed for 6 months after she died, that he sometimes stood in Oliver's doorway for 10 minutes after the boy fell asleep just to make sure he was still breathing, that he was afraid he was raising Oliver in a house with not enough laughter, that he missed being touched by another person so much that some nights the absence of it felt physical, like a bruise. They didn't talk about what they were doing. They didn't name it, didn't define it, didn't try to contain it inside a label or a category. It just existed, this thing between them, growing in the dark like something planted in soil that nobody expected to be fertile. On Thursday of the following week, 12 days after the cafe, Mason was at his desk when his phone rang. Not his personal phone, his work phone. The caller ID said Sterling Front Desk. Mr. Reed, there's a delivery for you in the lobby. So Mason went downstairs and found a box sitting on the reception counter. No return address. Inside was a stuffed ankylosaur. Not a cheap one, but a museum-quality replica, soft and detailed, with a weighted tail that actually swung. And a card that said, in clean, precise handwriting, for the kid who knows wrecking balls beat dumb plates. V? The receptionist looked at him with open curiosity. Secret admirer? Something like that. He brought it home. Oliver lost his mind. The ankylosaur was immediately named Captain, and Captain was introduced to Gerald the T-Rex in a ceremony that involved Oliver arranging all his plastic dinosaurs in a circle on the living room floor while narrating their reactions in different voices. Gerald says Captain can stay, Oliver announced from the floor, surrounded by his prehistoric parliament, but he has to sleep on the other pillow. Mason watched from the kitchen doorway, holding a spatula, wearing Rachel's old apron that he still hadn't replaced because it still smelled faintly like her perfume if he buried his face in it, which he did sometimes when Oliver wasn't looking. He took a photo of Oliver with Captain and sent it to Vanessa. Her reply, "Tell Oliver that Captain is honored to serve." Oliver, unprompted and with no knowledge of who had sent the gift, looked up from the floor and said, "Dad, who gave me Captain?" A friend. What friend? A friend from work. Oliver considered this with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice weighing a constitutional question. Is she nice? Mason froze. What makes you think it's a she? Because boys don't buy dinosaurs for other boys' kids. That's what Tyler's mom said when Tyler got a dinosaur from her boyfriend. Mason was going to have a talk with Tyler's mom about the romantic education she was apparently providing to the second grade class. But for now, he just said, Yeah, buddy, she's nice. Is she your girlfriend? No, she's just a friend. Okay. Oliver returned to his dinosaur parliament without further investigation, leaving Mason standing in the kitchen with a spatula in one hand and a question in his chest that he wasn't ready to answer. That night, after Oliver was asleep with Gerald under one arm and Captain under the other, Mason called Vanessa. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. He loves it. He named it Captain. Captain? She repeated the name like she was tasting it. Captain the Ankylosaur. I approve. Vanessa. Mason. There was a silence, the kind that holds weight, the kind that exists between two people who both know what needs to be said but are circling it the way you circle a deep pool before deciding whether to jump. Oliver asked if you were my girlfriend, Mason said. A pause. Then, what did you say? I said you were a friend. Another pause, longer this time. And what am I? The question hung between them across the miles of Chicago night, across the gap between a two-bedroom apartment on the north side and a townhouse on Lakeshore Drive, across all the distance that money and grief and fear had built between two people who were trying very hard not to need each other. I don't know, Mason said. I know that I think about you more than I should. I know that talking to you is the best part of my day, and that scares the hell out of me because the last time the best part of my day was a person, she died. And I know that you sent my kid a stuffed dinosaur and he treated it like a member of the family within 30 seconds. And that means something, even if I don't know what. He heard her exhale. Not a sigh. Something deeper. Something that sounded like a breath she'd been holding for a very long time. Daniel used to say I was bad at feelings, she said. He said I treated emotions like bugs in my code, something to identify and fix as quickly as possible so I could get back to running the program. Was he right? Completely. A small laugh, barely audible. I haven't been good at this in a long time, Mason. I'm not sure I was ever good at it. I built a company. I can read a balance sheet in my sleep. I can negotiate a merger with my eyes closed. But this, whatever this is, I don't have a framework for it. I don't have a strategy. I just have this feeling that keeps getting louder, no matter how many times I try to turn it down. What does it sound like? It sounds like your voice, telling me about dinosaurs and bad dates and monsters in closets. It sounds like something I forgot I wanted. Mason sat on his couch in the dark apartment, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the woman on the other end breathe, and felt something inside his chest. Something old, something he'd locked away so deep he'd forgotten where he put the key, begin to stir. He didn't say anything else that night. Neither did she. They just stayed on the line, listening to each other's silence, until Mason heard her breathing slow and realized she'd fallen asleep. He didn't hang up. He lay on the couch with the phone on the cushion beside him, her quiet breathing filling the room like a second heartbeat, and he stared at the ceiling and thought about a cardboard triceratops and a box of cream-colored envelopes, and a plastic dinosaur named Gerald, and a woman who'd driven across Chicago because he'd told her he was lonely. At some point, he fell asleep too. When he woke up at 3 in the morning, the call had ended. She must have woken up and disconnected. But there was a text sent at 1:47 a.m. Sorry I fell asleep. He typed back, Don't be. And then, because it was 3 in the morning and 3 in the morning was the 1 hour when Mason Reed allowed himself to be honest, he added, I liked knowing you were there. She didn't respond until morning. 6:15, right when his alarm went off. Just 2 words. Me too. Mason set the phone down, got out of bed, and went to pour 2 bowls of cereal. The blue bowl was already clean. The call from Oliver's school came at 2:47 on a Friday afternoon. Mason was in the middle of a code review, 4 browser tabs open, his coffee cold, Dave Barker arguing with someone from the QA team about a deployment timeline 3 desks away. His personal phone buzzed once, and he almost ignored it. He almost always ignored it during work hours, unless the caller ID said Oliver's school or the babysitter or his mother. This time it said Lincoln Elementary, and the cold that shot through his chest was immediate, instinctive, the kind of cold that every parent carries dormant inside them, like a virus waiting to activate. Mr. Reed, this is Nurse Callahan at Lincoln Elementary. Oliver's running a fever, 102.4. He's asking for you. Mason was on his feet before she finished the sentence. I'm on my way. He grabbed his bag, shoved his laptop in without closing the tabs, and was halfway to the elevator before Dave called after him. Everything okay? Oliver's sick. Gotta go. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't stop at the front desk. He didn't think about the code review or the deployment or the 3 meetings he had on his calendar for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about Oliver, and he moved. The train took 18 minutes. He counted every one. At the school, the nurse, a heavy woman with kind eyes and a lanyard covered in cartoon bandages, was waiting for him in the front office. Oliver was lying on the small cot in the nurse's station, his face flushed and damp. Gerald the T-Rex clutched against his chest like a shield. Dad? Oliver's voice was small, scratchy, stripped of the usual energy that powered it. My head hurts. Mason knelt beside the cot and put his hand on Oliver's forehead. Hot. Too hot. The kind of hot that made his stomach tighten and his mind start running worst-case scenarios the way it had been trained to do since Rachel died. Since the day he learned that the people you love could be taken from you without warning, without reason, without anything you could do to stop it. I know, buddy. We're going home. Is Gerald sick too? Gerald's fine. Gerald's tough. He doesn't feel tough. He feels hot. Mason wrapped Oliver in his jacket and carried him out of the school. The boy was heavier than he remembered. When had he gotten so heavy? And his arms around Mason's neck were limp and warm. In the car, Oliver fell asleep before they reached the first traffic light, his head against the window, his breath coming in the short, shallow puffs of a child whose body was fighting something it couldn't see. At home, Mason went through the routine he'd perfected over 7 years of single parenthood. Thermometer, children's Tylenol, cool washcloth on the forehead. The dinosaur blanket, the one Rachel's mother had made before Oliver was born, with little green stegosaurs stitched along the border, pulled up to his chin. Water on the nightstand. The dinosaur nightlight switched on even though it was still daylight outside, because Oliver once said the dinosaurs worked better in the dark. By 4:30, the fever had dropped to 101. Oliver was asleep, Gerald on one side, Captain the Ankylosaur on the other, his small body curled between them, like a general flanked by his most trusted soldiers. Mason sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair he'd sat in 100 times before, during ear infections and stomach bugs, and the one terrifying night when Oliver was 4, and his asthma had gotten so bad that Mason had driven to the emergency room at 2 a.m. with the boy wheezing in the back seat, and he'd sat in the waiting room surrounded by fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and bargained with the universe, offering anything, if his son would just be okay. Oliver had been okay. Oliver was always okay. But Mason never stopped bracing for the moment when he wouldn't be, because he'd learned, in the most permanent way a person can learn anything, that okay was not guaranteed. He pulled out his phone. 3 missed messages from Dave asking about the deployment. One from Maya, the babysitter, asking if she was still needed tonight. One from his mother with a recipe for chicken soup that he'd never make because his mother's recipes always required 17 ingredients and a level of patience that Mason simply did not possess. And one from Vanessa, sent 20 minutes ago. You left early. Everything okay? Mason looked at the message for a long time. He thought about what to type. He thought about the careful boundaries they'd been maintaining, the ones that kept their late-night phone calls separate from their daytime professional lives, the ones that allowed them to pretend that whatever was growing between them existed in a vacuum, untouched by the real world with its complications and consequences. He typed, Oliver has a fever. Picked him up from school. Her response was immediate. How high? 101 now. Was 102 when I got him. Has he been eating? Not much. He had some water. Is he sleeping? Yeah. A pause. Then, do you need anything? Mason stared at the question. 4 words, simple, direct, practical. And underneath them, something else entirely. The thing they'd been circling for 2 weeks. The thing that lived in the space between friend and whatever came after friend. The thing that Vanessa had called a feeling that kept getting louder. "We're okay," he typed. "Just a bug. Kids get 'em." "I know, but you're alone." He read that twice. You're alone. Not you're by yourself or is anyone with you, but you're alone. And the difference between those phrasings mattered in a way that Mason felt in his chest. "I'm used to it," he typed back. "That's not the same as okay." He didn't respond to that. He put the phone down and watched Oliver sleep, and the apartment was so quiet he could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the wind pushing against the windows, and underneath everything, the steady rhythm of Oliver's breathing. Slightly congested, slightly labored, but there, present, alive. Around 7, Oliver woke up. His fever had dropped to 99.8, close enough to normal that the knot in Mason's stomach loosened, just a little, and he sat up in bed with the groggy, confused expression of someone who'd lost a few hours and wasn't sure where they went. "Dad? Right here." "What time is it?" "Almost 7. You slept a long time." "I had a dream about Gerald." Oliver picked up the plastic T-Rex and examined him with clinical seriousness. He was at a restaurant and they didn't have any food he liked. "What food does Gerald like?" "Pizza, but not with the green things." "You mean peppers?" "The green things are gross, Dad." Mason felt himself smile, the first real smile since the phone call from the school, and it felt like unclenching a fist he hadn't realized was closed. "You hungry?" "A little." "Soup?" Oliver wrinkled his nose. "Can I have toast?" "You can have toast." Mason went to the kitchen and put 2 slices of bread in the toaster. The cheap toaster that only worked on one side, which meant he had to flip the bread halfway through, which meant he had to stand there and watch it. Which was fine, because standing in the kitchen watching toast was better than sitting in that chair watching his son's chest rise and fall while counting breaths. His phone buzzed on the counter. "Vanessa." "How is he?" "Fever's down. He's up, demanding toast." "Toast is a good sign." He also had a dream about Gerald at a restaurant. "Was the service good?" Mason actually laughed, out loud, alone in his kitchen, at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. The service was fine, but they didn't have pizza without the green things. Unacceptable. Gerald deserves better. The toast popped. Mason buttered it, cut it diagonally the way Oliver liked, and brought it to the bedroom on a plate. Oliver ate half a slice, drank some water, and then launched into a detailed analysis of why Triceratops would have been better at fighting than T-Rex, because they have 3 horns, Dad, and T-Rex only has a mouth. A very big mouth, though. But mouths can close. Horns are forever. Mason couldn't argue with that logic. He sat on the edge of the bed while Oliver talked, and something about the ordinariness of it, the warm room, the crumb-covered plate, the 7-year-old with flushed cheeks explaining dinosaur combat strategy, made him feel both overwhelmingly grateful and deeply, painfully sad, because Rachel should have been here for this. Rachel would have sat on the other side of the bed and listened just as seriously and made comments about the Triceratops' defensive posture that would have made Oliver laugh, and the 3 of them would have been a family, complete, whole, the way it was supposed to be. Instead, it was Mason. Just Mason. Trying to be enough. Oliver fell asleep again around 8:30, mid-sentence, the way kids do. Consciousness departing without ceremony, like a light switching off. One second he was explaining why ankylosaurs should be in the Olympics, and the next second he was gone, his mouth slightly open, his grip on Gerald loosening as sleep took him under. Mason tucked the blanket around him, turned the nightlight down to its lowest setting, and walked to the living room. The apartment felt enormous when Oliver was asleep. Too many empty chairs, too much quiet, too much space for thoughts to expand and fill. Mason sat on the couch and pulled out his phone and scrolled through nothing. News he didn't read, social media he barely used, emails he'd already answered, until his thumb found its way back to Vanessa's name. She'd texted again while he was with Oliver. "I know you said you're okay, but I keep thinking about you sitting in that room alone. I know what that feels like. I used to sit in Daniel's hospital room after the accident, before they told me he was gone, and I remember the silence being louder than anything I'd ever heard. Mason read the message 3 times. Then he called her. She picked up on the first ring. Hey. Hey. How is he? Sleeping. Fever's almost gone. He'll be fine. Good. A pause. You don't sound fine. Mason leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and pressed the heel of his free hand against his forehead. Every time he gets sick, I think about Rachel. I know. Not in a nostalgic way, in a terrified way. Like, what if this is it? What if this is the time it's not just a bug? What if I lose him the way I lost her and I didn't see it coming and there's nothing I can do? Mason, I know it's irrational. I know a fever of 102 isn't... I know that, logically. But logic doesn't work at 2 in the morning when your kid is hot and your wife is dead and you're the only one standing between him and whatever's out there. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was lower, softer, stripped of the controlled precision that defined her at the office. After Daniel died, I used to check the locks on my front door 4 times before bed. 4 times. Every night. Even though I had a security system. Even though I lived in a neighborhood where the most dangerous thing that ever happened was someone's Labrador getting loose. I checked the locks 4 times because if I only checked 3 times, I was convinced something terrible would happen. Did you stop? Eventually. Took about a year and I replaced it with something else. I started working 18-hour days instead. Same fear, different outlet. That's healthy? About as healthy as checking your son's breathing 3 times a night. Mason exhaled, a sound that was almost a laugh but not quite. We're a mess. Functional messes. Barely functional. Still counts. They were quiet for a moment. Not the heavy loaded silence of people who are afraid to speak, but the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of pretense and are resting in the space that's left. Vanessa. Yeah. When you asked me that question at the office, that first day, is she prettier than me? What were you actually asking? She didn't answer right away. He heard her shift, heard what might have been Professor's collar jingling in the background, heard the muffled sound of city traffic through windows high above the street. I was asking if you saw me, she said. Not the CEO, not the company, not the Forbes profile or the board presentations or the woman in the blazer who fires people on Tuesdays. Me. I was asking if you saw me, and I used the worst possible words to ask it because I panicked. You panicked. Vanessa Sinclair does not panic, except apparently when a software engineer with dinosaur stickers on his laptop mentions he has a date. You were jealous. I was terrified. There's a difference. She paused. Or maybe there isn't. I haven't figured that out yet. Terrified of what? Of missing my chance. I'd spent 2 years watching you from a distance, Mason. 2 years noticing the stickers and the Cheerio dust and the way you said Oliver's name. Not like a parent saying a child's name, but like a person saying the name of the most important thing in his life. And I never said anything because I'm the CEO and you're an employee and there are rules and power dynamics and HR policies, and because the last time I let myself care about someone, he died holding our wedding invitations. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically. Vanessa didn't do dramatic. Just a hairline fracture, thin and sharp, the kind that only someone listening very carefully would hear. And then you mentioned the date, she continued, and I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, just a quiet snap, like a branch giving way. And before I could think about it or strategize or run it through my internal committee, the question was already out of my mouth, and I was standing there in front of you with no plan and no framework, and nothing but the truth I'd been carrying for 2 years like a rock in my pocket. Mason sat in his dark living room and listened to the woman on the other end of the phone. This woman who ran a billion-dollar company, who negotiated with venture capitalists and board members and senators, who had been called the coldest woman in tech, come undone, piece by piece, the way ice comes undone in spring. Not all at once, in stages, in cracks and trickles and small, irreversible shifts. I see you, he said, for what it's worth. I see you. She didn't respond for several seconds. When she did, her voice was thick with something she was trying very hard to control. That's worth more than you know. Vanessa, I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. Okay? I'm scared. Not of you. Of this. Of whatever this is. Because I spent 4 years building a life that's small and safe and predictable, and I did it on purpose. I did it because the last time my life was big, the last time I had someone, the last time I let the walls down, it nearly killed me when it ended, and I don't know if I can survive that again. I'm not asking you to survive anything. I know, but that's what it feels like. It feels like standing on the edge of something, and I can see how beautiful it might be if I jump, but I can also see how far down the ground is. I'm standing on the same edge, Mason. The apartment was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Or maybe that was hers, traveling through radio waves and cell towers and miles of cold Chicago air, reaching him the way sound reaches the shore from a ship at sea, faint, persistent, real. I need to go check on Oliver, he said. I know. Can I call you tomorrow? You can call me whenever you want. He walked to Oliver's room, stood in the doorway, watched his son sleep, the fever down, the breathing steady, Gerald and Captain standing guard. The amber glow of the dinosaur nightlight painted the walls in soft gold, and the room smelled like children's Tylenol and peanut butter and the particular warmth of a child's bedroom at night. Mason's phone buzzed, a text from Vanessa. I know you're standing in his doorway right now. He almost asked how she knew, but he didn't, because the answer was obvious. She knew because she understood him. Not perfectly, not completely, but in the way that one broken thing recognizes another broken thing. The way two notes played at the same pitch create a resonance that neither one can produce alone. He typed back, guilty. How does he look? Like the most important thing in the world. A long pause. Then, he is. Mason put the phone in his pocket. He stood in the doorway for another 2 minutes, not counting breaths, not checking for danger, just watching, just being there. Then he went to the kitchen, washed the plate from Oliver's toast, wiped the counter, hung up Rachel's apron, and stood alone in the quiet apartment, thinking about the edge Vanessa had described, the one they were both standing on, the one where the view was terrifying and beautiful and impossible to look away from. He didn't jump that night, but he didn't step back either. He stood right there on the edge, and he let himself look. By Saturday morning, Oliver's fever was gone. Not gradually, not in stages, just gone, the way fevers in children disappear sometimes, as if the body simply decided it was finished being dramatic and moved on. He woke up at 6:30, demanding pancakes with a voice that showed no trace of the scratchy, fragile thing it had been 12 hours earlier, and Mason stood at the stove flipping batter and thinking that children's resilience was either a miracle or a personal insult to every adult who'd spent the night worrying about them. Can I have chocolate chips in mine? It's 6:30 in the morning. So chocolate chips are not a breakfast food. Gerald says they are. Mason looked at the plastic T-Rex propped against the sugar bowl on the kitchen table. Gerald stared back with painted black eyes that offered no opinion on the chocolate chip debate. Gerald's not a nutritionist, Mason said, but he put the chocolate chips in anyway because Oliver was healthy and smiling and asking for things with the casual entitlement of a kid who had no idea how close his father had been to a full-scale panic attack 18 hours ago. And Mason figured that chocolate chips at 6:30 in the morning were a small price to pay for the sound of his son's voice at full volume again. They ate together at the small kitchen table, say, Oliver in the blue bowl, Mason in whatever was clean. And Oliver talked without stopping about a kid in his class named Sophia, who had brought her hamster to school in her backpack, and how the hamster had escaped during reading time, and Mrs. Patterson had screamed and stood on her chair. And Oliver thought that was very funny because hamsters can't even bite that hard, Dad. And also he wanted a hamster. We'll talk about it, Mason said, which was parent code for absolutely not. And Oliver knew it was parent code for absolutely not, but accepted it anyway because he was 7, and the battle over the hamster was a long game he was willing to play. At 10 o'clock, Mason's phone buzzed. Vanessa. How's the patient? Fully recovered, currently lobbying for a hamster. A hamster? What happened to dinosaur loyalty? Apparently dinosaurs and hamsters can coexist. He's built a whole ecosystem. I respect the biodiversity. Mason smiled at his phone. And Oliver, who missed nothing, looked up from the Lego set he was constructing on the living room floor and said, "Who are you texting?" "Nobody." "You're smiling at nobody?" "I smile sometimes." "Not at your phone. You only smile at your phone when it's Aunt Emily or when you're looking at pictures of me." Mason put the phone down. "You're too observant for a 7-year-old. Mrs. Patterson says I have excellent attention to detail." "Mrs. Patterson is right." Oliver returned to his Legos, and Mason picked up his phone again and typed, "He's on to me. I think he's running surveillance. Smart kid. You should promote him." At noon, Vanessa sent another message. "Can I bring him something? I was thinking about stopping by, but only if that's okay. I don't want to overstep." Mason read the message twice. Then he looked around the apartment, at the breakfast dishes still in the sink, at the laundry basket in the hallway that he'd been meaning to fold since Wednesday, at the general state of lived-in disorder that defined a home occupied by a single father and a 7-year-old boy with a dinosaur collection that had colonized every flat surface. He thought about saying no. He thought about the boundaries he'd been so careful to maintain, the invisible lines that kept Vanessa in the category of late-night phone calls and daytime texts, separate from the physical reality of his life, which was messy and small and full of evidence that he was a man just barely holding everything together. But then he thought about what she'd said on the phone the night before, about standing on the same edge, about the same fear, about the same distance between wanting something and being brave enough to reach for it. He typed, "Come over. But fair warning, the apartment looks like a dinosaur fought a Lego factory and both sides lost. I'll manage." She arrived at 1:15. Mason heard the knock and had a brief, irrational moment of panic, the kind where you suddenly become aware of every imperfection in your home, your clothes, your life, before opening the door. Vanessa stood in the hallway holding a paper bag in one hand and looking nothing like the woman who ran Sterling Axis Technologies. She was wearing a dark green sweater that was slightly too big for her, jeans with a small hole above the left knee that looked like it had been earned rather than designed, and sneakers. Actual sneakers. White, slightly scuffed, the kind you buy because they're comfortable and not because they cost $400. Her hair was down again. Mason noticed this the way he noticed things about her now. Immediately, involuntarily, with a specificity that would have embarrassed him if he'd thought about it too hard. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She lifted the bag. "I brought cookies." "You didn't have to." "They're dinosaur-shaped. I found a bakery in Lincoln Park that makes custom sugar cookies. I may have gone overboard." Mason took the bag, looked inside, and found a dozen intricately decorated cookies shaped like various dinosaur species, each one painted in bright food coloring with a level of detail that suggested Vanessa had given the bakery very specific instructions. "Is that a Parasaurolophus?" he asked, holding up a cookie with a long curved crest. "It is. I did research." "You researched dinosaur cookies?" "I research everything." From the living room, Oliver's voice. "Dad, who's at the door?" Mason looked at Vanessa. She looked back at him. There was a question in the space between them. The question of what this was, of what she was doing here, of what it meant to invite a woman into the apartment where he'd raised his son alone for 4 years. Neither of them had an answer, but the question was there, and they both felt it. "Come in," Mason said. Vanessa stepped inside, and Mason watched her take in the apartment the way an engineer takes in a system. Quickly, methodically, without judgment. The small living room with the sagging couch. The kitchen with its cracked tile and its one working toaster. The hallway lined with Oliver's artwork. Crayon dinosaurs, watercolor rockets, a finger-painted portrait of Gerald that looked like a green blob with teeth. The bookshelf overflowing with picture books and field guides and a single framed photo of Rachel on the top shelf, smiling at the camera with Oliver, tiny, maybe 2 years old, perched on her hip. Vanessa's eyes paused on the photo, just for a second. Then she looked away. "Oliver," Mason called toward the living room. "Come here. Someone brought you something." Oliver appeared in the hallway, Gerald in one hand, Captain in the other, wearing pajama pants covered in rocket ships and a t-shirt that said Dino King in faded iron-on letters. He looked at Vanessa with the frank, unguarded appraisal that only children and very old people are capable of. "Hi," he said. Are you the one who gave me Captain? Mason hadn't told Oliver that. He looked at his son with surprise and then at Vanessa, who was looking at Oliver with an expression Mason had never seen on her face. Not in meetings, not in the cafe, not during their late-night phone calls. It was an expression of complete openness, like a window thrown wide, and it changed her entire face. I am, Vanessa said. She crouched down to Oliver's level, which put her at about 3 feet off the ground, and extended her hand. I'm Vanessa. Oliver shook her hand with the exaggerated seriousness of a child imitating an adult. I'm Oliver. Captain sleeps on my other pillow now. Gerald was jealous at first, but they worked it out. How did they work it out? I told Gerald that Captain was a herbivore, so he wouldn't eat any of Gerald's food. Gerald is a carnivore. They have different food groups. That's very diplomatic. What's diplomatic mean? It means you're good at making people and dinosaurs get along. Oliver considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the assessment. Dad said you're his friend from work. That's right. Do you know about dinosaurs? Some. Not as much as you, I bet. Nobody knows as much as me. That's what Mrs. Patterson says. She says I have a specialized interest. Specialized, Mason corrected gently. That's what I said. Oliver turned back to Vanessa. Do you want to see my collection? I would love to see your collection. And that was it. That was all it took. No awkwardness, no stiffness, no careful adult maneuvering. Oliver took Vanessa's hand, just reached out and grabbed it, the way children do when they've decided someone is safe, and led her to the living room, where the full extent of his dinosaur empire was on display. Mason stood in the hallway holding a bag of dinosaur cookies and watching the CEO of Sterling Access Technologies sit down on his living room floor while his 7-year-old son introduced her to every member of his plastic prehistoric army, one by one, with biographical details that he made up on the spot. This is Rex. He's the leader. He's grumpy but fair. This is Spike. She's a Stegosaurus, and she's in charge of defense. This is Tiny. He's an Allosaurus, but he's actually really big. I just named him Tiny because it's funny. Vanessa sat cross-legged on the carpet, her sneakers tucked under her knees, and listened to every word with a focus that Mason recognized. The same focus she brought to board meetings and investor calls, except now it was directed at a 7-year-old's imaginary dinosaur government, and she was treating it with exactly the same respect. What about Captain? She asked, pointing to the stuffed ankylosaur that Oliver had brought from the bedroom. Where does he rank? Captain is Special Forces. He only comes out for important missions. Like what? Like when Dad has a bad day. Captain is good at making bad days better. Vanessa glanced up at Mason, who was leaning against the doorframe. Their eyes met and something passed between them. Not a word, not a gesture, just a current, warm and steady, like electricity through a wire. Captain sounds very important, Vanessa said, turning back to Oliver. He is. He's the most important one after Gerald. They spent the next 2 hours on the living room floor. Vanessa helped Oliver build a Lego dinosaur habitat that incorporated an elaborate water feature made from a plastic cup and a system of tunnels constructed from paper towel rolls. Mason watched from the couch, occasionally handing over pieces or offering engineering advice that was mostly ignored because Oliver had very specific architectural standards, and Mason's suggestions were, according to his son, not how dinosaurs would do it. The cookies were a hit. Oliver ate 3 Parasaurolophuses and a Brachiosaurus and pronounced them the best cookies in the world, even better than the ones Grandma makes. But don't tell her I said that. Around 3:30, Oliver started yawning, his body still recovering from the fever, the burst of energy beginning to fade. He curled up on the couch with Gerald and Captain, and within 10 minutes, he was asleep, his head resting on a throw pillow that had seen better days, his mouth open, one sock on, and one sock mysteriously missing. Mason covered him with a blanket and turned to Vanessa, who was sitting on the floor surrounded by Lego pieces and paper towel tubes and the remains of a dinosaur-shaped cookie, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. He's incredible, she said quietly. He's a handful. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Mason sat down on the floor across from her, his back against the base of the couch. Between them, the Lego habitat sprawled like a miniature city, its paper towel tunnels slightly crushed, its plastic cup water feature tilted at an angle that defied physics. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for the cookies, for sitting on my floor for 2 hours listening to a 7-year-old explain dinosaur politics." "I didn't do it for you." Mason raised an eyebrow. "No? I did it for me. I haven't sat on a floor and built something with my hands in, I don't know how long, years, maybe since Daniel." She picked up a Lego brick and turned it over in her fingers. "He used to build model airplanes, the old kind with the glue and the tiny pieces. He'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, and I'd sit across from him working on my laptop, and we wouldn't talk, but we didn't need to. Just being in the same room was enough." "That sounds nice." "It was." She set the brick down. "I forgot what that feels like. Being in a room with someone and not needing to perform, not needing to be the CEO or the decision maker or the one with all the answers, just being." "You didn't perform today." "No, I didn't." They sat in the quiet. On the couch above them, Oliver shifted in his sleep, murmuring something about stegosaurs that neither of them could make out. The afternoon light came through the windows at a low angle, catching dust particles in the air and turning them gold. "Vanessa." "Yeah." "What are we doing?" She looked at him, not the sharp, analytical look she gave in meetings. Something slower, something that took its time. "I don't know." "That's not a very CEO answer." "I'm not your CEO right now." "Then what are you?" She held his gaze for a long time. The apartment was quiet except for Oliver's breathing and the distant hum of the city outside. "I'm someone who spent 3 years convincing herself she didn't need this, and I'm sitting on your living room floor covered in cookie crumbs, and your kid fell asleep on the couch, and I can hear him breathing, and it's the most peaceful sound I've heard since Daniel's heart monitor flatlined." Her voice didn't crack this time. It stayed steady, but Mason could see the effort it cost her. The way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers pressed harder against the carpet, the way she held herself very still, as if any sudden movement might break whatever was holding her together. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm controlling and I work too much, and I have a therapist who says I use achievement as a substitute for intimacy, and she's not wrong. I checked the locks on my door 3 times now, instead of 4, which my therapist says is progress, but I think is just a different number. I don't know how to do this, whatever this is, without trying to manage it like a project, and I know that's not how it works, but I don't know any other way." "Vanessa." "And I'm scared of Oliver, not of him. He's the best kid I've ever met. I'm scared of how much I already care about him, because caring about a child who isn't mine, that's a door I can't close once I walk through it. And if this doesn't work, if we try and it falls apart, I don't just lose you, I lose him too, and I've lost enough." "Vanessa." "What?" "Stop talking." She stopped. Mason reached across the Lego habitat and took her hand, not dramatically, not in a sweeping cinematic gesture. He just reached over and put his hand on hers, and she turned her palm up, and their fingers interlocked, and it was clumsy and imperfect, and his hand was sweaty because he was terrified, and her fingers were cold because she'd been gripping the carpet so hard the blood had drained from them. "I don't need you to be good at this," he said. "I'm not good at it either. I check my son's breathing 3 times a night. I eat mac and cheese from a Tupperware at my desk. I haven't changed the sheets on Rachel's side of the bed. There are parts of me that are still broken and might always be broken, and I can't promise you that I won't wake up some morning and decide that the safest thing to do is close every door I've opened and go back to the life where nothing can hurt me. That's terrifying. I know, but I'm telling you anyway because you just told me your worst parts, and I figure the least I can do is show you mine." She looked at their hands, his fingers dark against her pale skin, intertwined on the carpet between paper towel tubes and Lego bricks, and the scattered remains of dinosaur cookies. Her thumb moved across his knuckle, a small, unconscious motion, the kind of touch that happens before the brain gives permission. "Oliver asked me something the other day," Mason said. "He asked who gave him captain. I said a friend. He asked if you were my girlfriend. I said no. And now? And now I'm sitting on my living room floor holding hands with my CEO over a pile of Legos while my son sleeps 3 feet away.
And I think the honest answer is, I don't know what you are, but I know I don't want to stop finding out. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand, and it wasn't a gentle squeeze. It was tight, almost painful, the grip of someone who'd been reaching for solid ground and had finally found it. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay. We keep finding out.
They sat there on the floor, hands clasped, surrounded by the debris of a Saturday afternoon spent building dinosaur habitats with a 7-year-old, and neither of them moved to stand up or check their phones or break the silence. They just sat, and the light shifted, and the city moved outside the windows, and on the couch above them, Oliver slept with Gerald and Captain standing guard. Around 5, Oliver woke up hungry. Vanessa offered to order food, but Mason insisted on cooking, partly because he didn't want her to spend money on dinner, partly because he wanted to show her something real about his life, which included the fact that he could make exactly 4 meals with any competence, and 3 of them involved pasta. He made spaghetti. Vanessa sat at the kitchen table with Oliver, who was explaining in great detail why pasta should be called noodle snakes, because they looked like snakes and were slippery like snakes, and sometimes tried to escape off the fork like snakes.
He has a point, Vanessa said. Don't encourage him, Mason said from the stove. Noodle snakes, Oliver repeated with satisfaction. Vanessa agrees with me. Mason turned and saw them sitting together at his kitchen table, the woman with the hole above the knee of her jeans and the boy with one sock missing, and felt something unlock inside his chest that he'd been keeping sealed for so long he'd forgotten what was in there. It was warmth. Not the desperate, clinging warmth of loneliness finding relief, but something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of a foundation, something that, if he was very careful and very brave and very lucky, might one day hold the weight of a life larger than the one he'd been living. They ate dinner together. The spaghetti was slightly overcooked. Oliver got sauce on his shirt, and Vanessa got sauce on her sweater, and Mason got sauce on the counter and the floor, and somehow the ceiling, which none of them could explain.
It was messy and loud and imperfect, and nothing about it was elegant or polished. It was the best meal Mason had eaten in 4 years. After dinner, Vanessa helped Oliver brush his teeth, a process that involved negotiation, a timer shaped like a frog, and a debate about whether dinosaurs had to brush their teeth too, and then sat on the edge of his bed while Mason read the dinosaur book. She listened the way Oliver listened, with full attention, and when the story was over, Oliver looked at her with the sleepy, trusting eyes of a child who has decided without ceremony or analysis that a person belongs. Vanessa? Yeah? Are you coming back tomorrow? Vanessa looked at Mason. Mason looked at Vanessa. If your dad says it's okay, she said. Oliver turned to Mason. Dad, say it's okay. Mason felt the word forming before he chose it, rising from somewhere deeper than thought, from the place where the locked room in his chest had finally cracked open and let the light pour through. It's okay, he said. Oliver smiled, the huge, gap-toothed, unguarded smile that was the single most valuable thing in Mason's world, and pulled the blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes. Night, Dad. Night, Vanessa. Night, Gerald. Night, Captain. Good night, buddy. Good night, Oliver. They walked out of the room together, and Vanessa pulled the door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack, the way Mason always did without being told. He noticed. He noticed. And the noticing hit him somewhere behind his ribs with a force that surprised him. In the hallway, standing between Oliver's closed door and the living room full of Lego debris and spaghetti-stained napkins, Vanessa turned to him. I should go. Yeah. It's getting late. Yeah. Neither of them moved. Mason. Yeah. Today was the happiest I've been in 3 years. He looked at her. Sauce on her sweater, hair coming loose from whatever she'd done with it that morning, standing in his dim hallway that smelled like garlic and children's toothpaste. And he felt the edge again. The one they'd been standing on for weeks. The one where the view was terrifying and beautiful and impossible to turn away from. Me too, he said. She reached up and touched his face, just her fingertips against his jaw, barely there, the lightest contact. He didn't move. She didn't move.
They stood in the hallway for a moment that lasted much longer than it should have, and then she dropped her hand and stepped back. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow." She walked to the front door. He opened it for her. She stepped into the hallway, turned, and looked at him one more time. "Mason?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for letting me in." She wasn't talking about the apartment.
"Thank you for showing up," he said. She walked down the hallway toward the elevator, and Mason stood in the doorway watching her go. The way she walked, the way she held her shoulders, the way she pressed the elevator button and turned back to look at him one last time before the doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. She was gone. Mason stood in the doorway for a long time after that, listening to the silence of the hallway, feeling the weight of the day settle around him. Behind him, the apartment was warm and cluttered and alive with the evidence of what had happened. Lego pieces on the carpet, cookie crumbs on the floor, 2 plates and 3 forks in the sink, and his son asleep in the other room with a plastic T-Rex and a stuffed ankylosaur that a woman had bought because she cared about a boy she'd never met. He closed the door, locked it once, stood there, hand on the deadbolt, and thought about Vanessa checking her locks 4 times, then 3 times, and calling that progress. He checked his lock once. That was enough. Vanessa came back the next day. And the day after that. It wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic turning point. It was Sunday morning, 10:15, a knock on the door, and Oliver answering it before Mason could get there because 7-year-olds operate on a first-come, first-served policy with doorbells and knocks and anything that might involve a visitor. "Vanessa!" Oliver threw the door open like he was greeting a head of state. "Dad's making eggs and they're burning." "They're not burning," Mason called from the kitchen, where the eggs were, in fact, burning. Vanessa stepped inside carrying a bag from the bakery. More dinosaur cookies, because apparently she'd found the one currency that guaranteed Oliver's unconditional loyalty, and walked straight to the kitchen, where she stood beside Mason at the stove and looked at the pan with the diplomatic restraint of a woman choosing her words very carefully. "Those are burning," she said. "I know. Want me to—" "No. I'm just saying, if you turn the heat down, I know how to make eggs, Vanessa." The smoke detector disagrees, and Oliver appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The smoke thingy is beeping again, Dad." Mason grabbed a dish towel, fanned the smoke detector into silence, scraped the eggs onto 3 plates, and set them on the table with the weary pride of a man who had technically completed the task he set out to do, even if the results were questionable. They ate together. The eggs were dry. Oliver ate them without complaint because Vanessa was eating them without complaint, and Oliver had apparently decided that whatever Vanessa did was worth copying. After breakfast, Oliver asked if Vanessa wanted to meet Professor, and Vanessa said yes, and Oliver asked if they could go to her house, and Mason said that was up to Vanessa, and Vanessa said okay, and 45 minutes later, Mason was standing in the foyer of a Lakeshore Drive townhouse that cost more than he would earn in 3 lifetimes. Watching his son chase an arthritic, mostly blind golden retriever across a living room that had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The townhouse was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, tasteful, restrained, curated. But it was also quiet in a way that told Mason everything he needed to know about what Vanessa's life looked like when she wasn't at the office. The furniture was perfect. The surfaces were clean. The kitchen looked like it had been staged for a magazine shoot rather than used to cook actual food. The only evidence that a human being lived here was a dog bed in the corner, a stack of business books on the coffee table, and a single-framed photograph on the mantel. Daniel, Mason assumed, though he didn't ask, a man with dark hair and a wide smile, sitting on a beach somewhere, squinting into the sun. Oliver was oblivious to all of it. He was on the floor with Professor, who had rolled onto his back with his paws in the air and was accepting belly rubs with the dignified resignation of a very old dog who had learned long ago that children were loud and grabby, but also very warm. "He likes you," Vanessa said, sitting on the couch beside Mason. "Professor doesn't like most people. He growled at my CFO once." "Smart dog," Mason said. Vanessa smiled. A real one. The kind that reached her eyes. The kind Mason was learning to look for because it was different from the smile she used in meetings and interviews and public appearances. This one was unstructured, unplanned, slightly crooked on the left side. It was the smile she'd probably had at 20, before Daniel, before the company, before the world taught her that smiling too wide was a vulnerability. They spent the morning there. Oliver explored every room, asked approximately 400 questions about the Lakeview, tried to teach Professor to fetch a ball. The dog caught it once, mostly by accident, and Oliver celebrated like they'd won a championship, and eventually fell asleep on Vanessa's couch with Professor curled beside him, the old dog's head resting on the boy's leg. Mason and Vanessa sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching them through the doorway. The boy and the dog, asleep together on a couch that cost more than Mason's car, in a house that belonged to a woman who, 3 weeks ago, had been nothing more than his CEO. "He fits here," Vanessa said quietly. "He fits everywhere. That's his superpower." "I'm serious, Mason." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm serious too. He fits everywhere because Rachel raised him that way. To be open, to be curious, to walk into a room full of strangers and find a friend. I can't take credit for that. That was all her." It was the first time he'd mentioned Rachel by name in Vanessa's presence since the cafe. The name settled between them like a third person at the table, present, real, impossible to ignore. "Tell me about her," Vanessa said. Mason looked at his coffee. He turned the mug slowly in his hands, watching the dark surface rotate. "You don't have to do that." "Do what?" "Ask about her. You don't have to perform the thing where you pretend to be comfortable talking about the dead wife because you think it's what I need." "I'm not performing. I'm asking because she matters. She's part of you, and she's part of Oliver. And if I'm going to be in your lives, if that's what's happening here, then I need to know who she was. Not a version of her. Not a curated memory. Her." Mason looked at Vanessa for a long time. Then he looked at the doorway, where Oliver slept on the couch, with his hand resting on an old dog's head, and he felt the locked room in his chest, the one he'd spent 4 years sealing shut, open a little wider. "She was messy," he said, "not in a charming way, in a real way. She left dishes in the sink and clothes on the bathroom floor, and she could never find her keys. She lost her keys at least 3 times a week. I bought her one of those tile trackers, and she lost the tracker." Vanessa made a sound that might have been a laugh. "She was loud. She sang in the shower badly. And she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which meant you never actually heard the punchline. She cried at every movie, including action movies that had no reason to make anyone cry. She once cried during a car commercial because the dad drove his daughter to college, and she said it reminded her of her father, who had never driven her to college because she went to community college 3 miles from their house and took the bus. He was smiling now, and it hurt, the way smiling about Rachel always hurt. A pain that was inseparable from the pleasure, like pressing a bruise you can't stop touching. She was impatient. She burned everything she cooked because she always turned the heat too high because she didn't want to wait. She was terrible at math. She was afraid of spiders but pretended not to be because she thought it was embarrassing. She snored. She denied it, but she snored. "She sounds real," Vanessa said. She was. That was the thing about Rachel. She was the most real person I ever met. No filter, no pretense, no performance. What you saw was what you got, and what you got was someone who was difficult and kind and frustrating and warm and imperfect in every way that made her perfect for me. He stopped, took a breath. The coffee was cold. "I used to think that loving someone like that was a one-time thing," he said. "That you get one shot, and if it ends, you spend the rest of your life managing the aftermath. Like grief is just maintenance on a system that's already shut down. And now? Now I'm sitting in your kitchen while my kid sleeps on your couch, and I don't know what to do with that." Vanessa reached across the table and put her hand on his. Not the way she'd done it the day before, clumsy, desperate, fingers cold. This time it was deliberate, warm. Her thumb rested on his wrist, and he could feel his own pulse against her skin. "You don't have to know yet," she said. "Neither do I. We just have to not run." "That's your strategy? Don't run?" "It's the best I've got. My therapist says I should try being present instead of productive, and honestly, it makes me want to break out in hives, but I'm trying." He laughed. Not a big laugh. A quiet one. The kind that comes from a genuine place. The kind that doesn't need volume to be real. Your therapist sounds smart. She charges $400 an hour. She better be smart. They stayed until Oliver woke up, and then Mason took him home, and Vanessa walked them to the door, and Oliver hugged her legs. Just wrapped his arms around her knees and squeezed, the way he hugged Mason or his grandmother or anyone he'd decided belonged to him. And Vanessa put her hand on the boy's head and looked at Mason over Oliver's small body with an expression that said everything they hadn't said yet. That night, after Oliver was in bed, Mason sat alone in the living room and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He took Rachel's photo from the bookshelf and held it. It was a photo from their wedding, not the professional one, not the posed shot with the flowers and the lighting, the candid one. Rachel in her dress, slightly crooked, her veil already coming loose because she'd been dancing. She was laughing at something Mason had said. He couldn't remember what, and her eyes were closed and her head was thrown back, and the joy in her face was so complete and so unguarded that looking at it still felt like staring into the sun. "I met someone," he said to the photo. The words felt strange in the apartment, spoken aloud to no one, to a face frozen behind glass. "I think you'd like her. She's stubborn and controlling, and she checks her locks 3 times. And she bought Oliver a stuffed dinosaur without ever meeting him. And she sat on our floor and built Legos for 2 hours, and listened to him explain why ankylosaurs should be in the Olympics." He paused, swallowed. "She lost someone too. A guy named Daniel. She carries it the way I carry you. Like a weight she's learned to balance, but never learned to set down. We're both walking around with these holes in our chests, Rachel, and I think maybe we're trying to figure out if 2 people with holes can build something that holds." He looked at the photo. Rachel laughed her silent, frozen laugh. "I'm not replacing you. I need you to know that. Nobody replaces you. But I think I'm ready to stop pretending that being alone is the same as being okay. Because it's not. It never was. And Oliver needs more than a dad who's just surviving. He needs a dad who's actually living." He put the photo back on the shelf, straightened it, touched the frame once, the way you touch a door handle before leaving a room for the last time. Then he picked up his phone and called Vanessa. "Hey," she said. "Hey. Everything okay?" "Yeah, I wanted to tell you something." "Okay." "I talked to Rachel just now, her photo." A pause, not uncomfortable, expectant. "What did you tell her?" "That I met someone, that I think she'd like you, that I'm done pretending being alone is the same thing as being okay." Vanessa was quiet for a long time, long enough that Mason checked the screen to make sure the call was still connected. "Vanessa? I'm here." Her voice was thick. "I'm just processing." "Take your time." "I did something too, today, after you left." "What?" "I listened to Daniel's last voicemail." Mason held his breath. "I listen to it every year on his birthday," Vanessa continued. "Just once. It's him saying he's on his way to pick up the wedding invitations and asking if I wanted cream or ivory because apparently there's a difference, and he was making fun of how many decisions weddings require. He's laughing in it. He's laughing, and you can hear traffic in the background, and it lasts 11 seconds. "Vanessa, I've never listened to it on a day that wasn't his birthday, but today I did, and instead of crying, I smiled, because he sounded happy. He sounded like someone who was having a good day, and I realized I've spent 3 years hearing that voicemail as the last thing he ever said, and today was the first time I heard it as just a man having a good day. That's a big thing." "I know." Another pause. And then I deleted it. The silence between them was so complete that Mason could hear the wind against Vanessa's windows, 16 floors up. "Not because I'm forgetting him," she said quickly, "and not because of you, not because of us, but because I've been holding on to 11 seconds of someone else's life like it was the only proof that he existed, and it's not. He existed in the 3 years we spent together and the plans we made and the life he wanted to live. He doesn't need 11 seconds on my phone to be real. He's real in the way I love people now, carefully, terrified, checking locks, because he taught me what it feels like to lose someone you're not done loving."
Mason sat in his apartment and listened to the woman on the other end of the phone let go of something she'd been carrying for 3 years, and he thought about the photo on his bookshelf and the words he'd spoken to a face behind glass, and he understood, not intellectually, but somewhere deeper, somewhere in the damaged architecture of his chest, that this was what it looked like when two broken people stopped trying to fix themselves alone. "I'm not going to be easy," Vanessa said. "You know that." "I know. I'm going to work too much. I'm going to try to control things I can't control. I'm going to have nights where I check the locks more than 3 times, and mornings where I wake up and the first thing I think about is cream versus ivory envelopes, and I'm going to be difficult." "I know. And you're going to check Oliver's breathing 6 times instead of 3. You're going to pull away when things feel too good, because too good feels dangerous. You're going to have days where you look at me and see everything you could lose instead of everything you could have. Probably. So we're a mess. A functional mess. Barely. Still counts." She laughed. A real laugh. The kind that sounded like it surprised her. The kind that cracked the controlled surface of her voice and let something warm spill through. "Still counts." They talked for another hour. Not about anything important. About Professor's vet appointment. About Oliver's ongoing hamster campaign. About whether Mason should learn to cook more than 4 things, and whether Vanessa should learn to cook at all. They talked about the weather and about a documentary Vanessa had watched about octopuses, and about the fact that Dave Barker had started bringing his own coffee machine to work because he said the office coffee tasted like sadness in a cup, which Vanessa said she could not officially agree with as CEO, but privately found accurate. They talked, and the city hummed around them. Different neighborhoods, different windows, different lives. And the words moved between them the way water moves through a system, finding the channels, filling the spaces, following the path of least resistance towards something that looked, from a certain angle, like connection. Monday at the office, they were professional. Vanessa walked past his desk at 9:15 and said, "Good morning," with the same neutral tone she used with everyone else. And Mason said, "Good morning" back. And Dave Barker noticed nothing, which was the whole point. But at lunch, Mason's phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. "The eggs were better today." He typed back, "I turned the heat down." Growth. That evening, Vanessa came to dinner. She came the next evening too, and the one after that. By Thursday, Oliver had stopped asking if Vanessa was coming and started asking what time she was coming, as if her presence was no longer a question but a variable, but accounted for, expected, built into the routine. She wasn't perfect at it. Nobody told you that about falling into someone's life, that it wasn't a graceful process, that it involved wrong turns and awkward silences and moments where the machinery of 2 separate worlds ground against each other before finding a shared rhythm. Vanessa didn't know how to talk to a 7-year-old about his day without interviewing him like a job candidate. She loaded the dishwasher incorrectly, and Mason reorganized it after she left, which she noticed and was annoyed about. She once tried to help Oliver with his math homework and explained long division using the word optimization, which made Oliver stare at her like she'd spoken in tongues. And Mason wasn't perfect either. He forgot to tell her about Oliver's peanut allergy until she'd already bought peanut butter cookies, and the look on her face, the genuine unmasked terror of someone who'd almost inadvertently hurt a child she cared about, made Mason realize how deep her investment had already grown. He fell asleep during a movie they were watching after Oliver went to bed and woke up to find her sitting alone on his couch in the dark, watching him sleep with an expression he couldn't read, and the vulnerability of that moment, of being watched, of being seen in the unguarded state of sleep, made something inside him flinch before it relaxed. They argued once, badly, about whether Oliver should know that Vanessa was more than a friend. Mason wanted to wait. Vanessa said waiting was just a polite word for hiding. Mason said she didn't understand how careful you had to be with a kid who'd already lost one person. Vanessa said she understood loss better than he wanted to admit. They didn't speak for 2 days, and those 2 days were the longest of Mason's recent life. Longer than the nights after Rachel died, longer than the hours in the emergency room with Oliver's asthma, because this silence was different. This silence was a choice, and choices could be unmade or they could become permanent, and Mason didn't know which way this one was going to go.
It was Oliver who broke the standoff. Not intentionally. He came home from school on that second silent day, sat at the kitchen table with his snack, and said very casually, "Dad, how come Vanessa didn't come yesterday?" "She was busy." "She's always busy, but she always comes." "Not always." Oliver ate a grape. Studied it the way he studied everything. Seriously, thoroughly, with the focus of a small person trying to understand a large world. "Did you have a fight?" "Why would you think that?" "Because you look the way Tyler's dad looks when Tyler's mom is mad at him. Kind of squished." "I don't look squished." "You look a little squished, Dad." Mason sat down across from his son and looked at this small human being who had Rachel's nose and his own jaw and the uncanny ability to see through every wall Mason had ever built. "Yeah, buddy, we had a disagreement." "About what?" "Grown-up stuff." "Was it about me?" The accuracy of the question hit Mason in the chest. "Why do you ask that?" "Because people fight about kids. Tyler's parents fight about Tyler all the time. Tyler says it's because his mom thinks his dad feeds him too much sugar, but I think it's about other stuff too." Mason looked at his son, 7 years old, missing 2 front teeth, saw stains on his shirt from yesterday, holding a grape in one hand and Gerald in the other, and seeing everything. "It was partly about you," Mason said. "Vanessa wanted to talk to you about something, and I wasn't sure you were ready." "Talk to me about what?" Mason took a breath. He thought about what Vanessa had said, that waiting was just hiding. He thought about Emily's voice on the phone. "Don't close the door before you know what's on the other side." He thought about the photo on the bookshelf and the words he'd spoken to a face behind glass. "Vanessa and we care about each other, a lot. More than regular friends." Oliver's expression didn't change. He ate another grape. "I know." What do you mean, you know?" "Dad, she comes here every night. She knows which bowl I like. She calls Professor the old man, and he sits in her lap even though she says he's too heavy. She smells like the nice soap at the store that you always look at but never buy." Mason blinked. "She is your girlfriend," Oliver said. Not a question. A statement delivered with the absolute certainty of a child who had observed the evidence and reached the only logical conclusion. "Would that be okay?" Mason asked. "If she was..." Oliver thought about it, really thought, with the same seriousness he brought to dinosaur classification and pasta taxonomy and the great hamster debate. Then he said, "Does she make you happy?" The question was so simple and so direct that it cut through every layer of fear and caution and self-protection that Mason had wrapped around himself like armor. "Does she make you happy? Not does she fit into our lives, or does she meet some impossible standard, or does she replace what we lost? Just, does she make you happy?" "Yeah, buddy," Mason said. "She does." "Then it's okay." Oliver ate his last grape. "Can I call her now and tell her to come to dinner? I want to show her the Lego thing I built at school." Mason handed Oliver the phone, and he watched his 7-year-old son dial Vanessa Sinclair. Billionaire CEO, Ice Queen of Michigan Avenue, the most intimidating woman in Chicago tech, and say, "Vanessa, it's Oliver. Dad says you're his girlfriend. Can you come to dinner? I built a stegosaurus at school and the tail falls off, but I can fix it." Mason couldn't hear Vanessa's response, but he could hear Oliver laugh, and then he could hear Oliver say, "Yeah, he looks better now, less squished." She came to dinner that night. She came through the door and Oliver hugged her legs the way he always did. And she put her hand on his head the way she always did. And then she looked at Mason over Oliver's small body, and her eyes were red, and her jaw was tight, and she was holding herself together with the same effort she'd held herself together in the cafe 3 weeks ago, when she'd told him about cream-colored envelopes and a man who died laughing. "He called me," she said. "I know. He called me and told me I was your girlfriend. He's very direct." "Mason, Come inside." She came inside. Oliver dragged her to the living room to show her the stegosaurus with the detachable tail. Mason went to the kitchen and started making pasta, the only reliable dish in his repertoire, and listened to the sound of his son's voice and the sound of Vanessa's voice and the sound of them together, filling the apartment with something it had been missing for 4 years, not replacing what was lost. That was the thing Mason was slowly learning, the thing that nobody tells you about grief and love, and the strange, messy territory where they overlap. Vanessa didn't fill the space Rachel left. Nothing filled that space. That space existed, permanent and real. Like a room in a house that you keep the door closed on but never demolish. It was there. It would always be there. And that was okay. What Vanessa did was build a new room. Adjacent, connected, part of the same structure, but different. Different furniture, different light, different air. A room that existed not because the old one was inadequate, but because the house was bigger than Mason had thought. Because there was space he hadn't known about, space he hadn't explored, space that had been waiting in the dark for someone to come along and turn the lights on. After dinner, the spaghetti was properly cooked this time, which felt like a metaphor. Oliver went to bed. The routine was established now. Mason read the dinosaur book. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed. Oliver said goodnight to Gerald and Captain and Professor, even though Professor was across the city because Oliver insisted the dog could hear him if he said it loud enough. And then both adults walked out together. In the living room, with Oliver's breathing steady down the hall, Vanessa turned to Mason. "So," she said, "your son informed me that I'm your girlfriend." "He did. He didn't ask. He told. He gets that from Rachel." Vanessa smiled. "The crooked one, the real one." "Is he right?" "I don't know. Are you?" "I'm standing in your apartment at 9 o'clock on a Thursday with spaghetti sauce on my jeans and a stegosaurus tail in my pocket because your son gave it to me for safekeeping. So, yeah, I think I might be." Mason stepped closer to her. Not a big step, just one. Enough to close the distance between them from several feet to almost nothing. Close enough to see the scar above her eyebrow, the faint circles under her eyes, the small lines at the corners of her mouth that appeared when she was trying not to smile. "I'm going to check Oliver's breathing 3 times tonight," he said. "I know. And I'm going to wake up at some point and reach for the other side of the bed, and no one will be there, and it'll hurt." "I know. And there will be mornings when I look at Rachel's photo and miss her so much I can't breathe." "I know, Mason. But I don't want to do any of that alone anymore." Vanessa looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the cafe 3 weeks ago, with those sharp, dark eyes that could evaluate a balance sheet in seconds and dismantle a competitor in minutes, but couldn't quite figure out what to do with a software engineer who had dinosaur stickers on his laptop and a hole in his chest where a wife used to be. "Then don't," she said. He kissed her. Not the way people kiss in movies. Not slow motion, not with swelling music, not with perfect lighting and perfect angles and perfect everything. He kissed her the way real people kiss for the first time. Slightly off center, noses bumping, his hand on her waist landing too high before adjusting, her fingers gripping his shirt too hard before loosening. It was awkward and imperfect, and his heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could feel it through his chest. And when they pulled apart, they were both breathing faster than normal, and neither of them said anything for several seconds. Then Vanessa smiled, the real smile, the one that cracked her open and let everything warm and scared and human pour through. "So," she said, "was your date prettier than me?" The question, the same 5 words that had detonated the wall between them in a corporate office 3 weeks ago, the same 5 words that had sent a tremor through Mason's careful, coded life and cracked the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself and his future, the same 5 words spoken now in his living room, surrounded by Lego pieces and spaghetti-stained napkins and the distant sound of his son breathing. "Not even close," Mason said. Vanessa laughed, a real, full, unguarded laugh, the kind she probably hadn't heard herself make in 3 years. It filled the apartment the way warmth fills a room when you finally open the curtains after a long winter. She left at 10. Mason walked her to the door and she turned in the hallway and looked at him, and they stood there for a moment, not saying anything, not needing to, and the hallway was quiet and the building was quiet, and somewhere outside Chicago was doing what Chicago does on cold October nights, moving, breathing, carrying millions of lives through its streets, like blood through arteries, each one private, each one singular, each one certain that no one else in the city could possibly understand what they were feeling. "Good night," Vanessa said. "Good night." She walked toward the elevator, pressed the button, turned back to look at him one last time. "Mason?" "Yeah?" "I'm going to check my locks twice tonight. Not 3 times, twice." "That's progress." "My therapist will be thrilled." She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She was gone. Mason stood in the doorway for a long time, not because he was watching her leave, but because he was feeling something he hadn't felt in 4 years, something that existed in the space between the grief and the fear and the stubbornness and the love, something that wasn't the end of anything but the beginning of something, messy and real and completely unpredictable. He went back inside, walked to Oliver's room, stood in the doorway. The boy slept the way he always slept, diagonally, blankets twisted, one sock missing, Gerald under one arm and Captain under the other. The dinosaur nightlight cast amber patterns across the ceiling. The room smelled like soap and peanut butter and the particular warmth that only exists in a child's bedroom at night. Mason didn't count Oliver's breaths. For the first time in 4 years, he didn't count. He just stood there watching, and the watching was enough. He turned, walked down the hallway and past the bookshelf. Rachel smiled at him from behind glass, laughing, veil coming loose, eyes closed, joy so complete it radiated from the photograph like heat from a fire. He touched the frame, not to say goodbye, just to say, "I'm okay. We're okay." In the living room, scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a very small, very happy disaster, were the remnants of the evening. Lego bricks, cookie crumbs, a stegosaurus tail that Vanessa had taken with her in her pocket, 3 plates in the sink instead of 2, and a single unfinished Lego dinosaur that Oliver had been building with Vanessa before bedtime, sitting on the coffee table next to Gerald's backup throne, a cardboard box labeled Gerald's office in Oliver's handwriting. Mason picked up one of the Lego bricks, turned it over in his hand, set it back down. The apartment was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a man sitting alone in a space built for more. This was the quiet that comes after something good, the quiet of a room still warm from the people who were just in it, the quiet that holds the echo of laughter and conversation, and a 7-year-old explaining Stegosaurus anatomy to a woman he'd already decided belonged. Mason sat on the couch. He didn't turn on the television, he didn't pick up his phone, he just sat, and he breathed, and he let the silence be what it was. Not empty, but full. Full of the voices that had been there an hour ago, full of the ones that would be there tomorrow. People talk about love like it's a rescue, like it arrives on horseback and pulls you from the wreckage and carries you towards some golden horizon where everything makes sense. But that's not how it works. Not really. Not for the people who've been broken by it before. For them, for the Masons and the Vanessas, love doesn't rescue. It just shows up. It shows up at your door with dinosaur cookies. It shows up at a cafe at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night because you sent a text you shouldn't have sent. It shows up imperfect and terrified and covered in spaghetti sauce, and it says, not I'll save you, but I'll sit with you. On the floor. In the mess. For as long as you'll let me. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Mason Reed was 32 years old. He was a software engineer. He was a single father. He had a son who named his dinosaurs and a woman who was learning to check her locks only twice, and a dead wife whose photo lived on a bookshelf where it would always live, smiling her frozen smile, reminding him that love doesn't disappear when the person does. It just changes shape. It becomes the way you butter toast diagonally, the way you save the blue bowl, the way you stand in a doorway at midnight, watching your child breathe, knowing that you are not enough, that you will never be enough, and showing up anyway. He leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes. Outside, the city moved through the October night, cold, restless, indifferent, carrying its millions of stories through streets that didn't care who was happy or who was heartbroken, or who was, at this very moment, sitting alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side, realizing for the first time in 4 years that alone and lonely were not the same thing and that one of them had just ended. Behind him, in the other room, Oliver slept with his dinosaurs. Across the city, in a townhouse on Lakeshore Drive, a woman checked her locks twice and went to bed with a blind old dog at her feet and a stegosaurus tail in her pocket. And in the quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a life that was larger than it had been yesterday, Mason finally understood something he'd spent 4 years refusing to believe. That the heart doesn't have a capacity. It doesn't run out of room. It doesn't need to delete the old to make space for the new. It just builds. It builds new rooms, new hallways, new windows that let in light you didn't know existed. After years of surviving alone, his heart was finally ready to live again.